The float stops moving at 4:47 in the morning, 17 meters before the exit gate of the Sambadrome. And in that instant, 83 minutes of flawless choreography can become irrelevant. Behind it, 6,000 performers freeze in formation on the avenue. Ahead, the next school waits in the assembly zone, their entry window shrinking by the second. The judges have already marked the timestamp. Every minute of delay costs points. In a competition decided by fractions, this mechanical failure just erased a year of preparation and 5 million riers of investment. The dispersion area at the end of the Sambadrome is not designed for stopover. It is a funnel, a narrow concrete throat that must swallow an entire school in under 12 minutes and expel it into the city before the next wave arrives. The space is barely wide enough for the largest floats to pass through, with centimetres to spare on either side. There are no storage zones, no parking lanes, no margin for error. Everything that enters must exit immediately into the street grid of downtown Rio, where 40-ton platforms meet city traffic, pedestrian crossings, and overhead power lines at 6 in the morning. When a float becomes immobile in this channel, the entire system behind Carnival, the precise sequencing of 14 samba schools across 2 nights, the coordination of 70,000 performers, the scheduling of broadcast windows and judging panels, grinds against itself. The dispersion area is where the controlled chaos of the parade meets the uncontrolled chaos of the city. It is where the show ends and the problem begins. The modern Sambadrome, completed in its current form in 1984, was designed by Oscar Niemeyer as a permanent home for the parade, replacing decades of temporary grandstands along Avenida Rio Branco. But Niemeyer designed a theatre for spectacle, not a factory for logistics. The dispersion zone was an afterthought, a simple exit ramp that assumed smooth operation. It did not account for the physics of moving structures that weigh as much as loaded cement trucks, powered by engines that overheat in tropical humidity. Navigating turns designed for passenger cars, the first major dispersion crisis occurred in 1991, when a float from Mocidade Independente lost hydraulic pressure. Halfway through the exit ramp, the float carried a 30-meter rotating tower, and when the hydraulics failed, the tower locked at a 40-degree angle, too tall to pass under the concrete overhang. The school's entire parade ground to a halt. Performers sat on the asphalt in full costume while engineers attempted repairs with hand tools. The delay cascaded into the next school's entry time, which cascaded into broadcast schedules, which cascaded into penalties that knocked Mocidade out of championship contention. The school spent the next year redesigning their floats with collapsible structures and backup hydraulic lines. This created an arms race. Every school began over-engineering their floats for reliability, which made them heavier, which strained the engines, which increased the likelihood of breakdowns. The dispersion area became a test of durability as much as artistry. Schools that could move their floats through the exit without stopping gained a hidden advantage, not in the judges' scores, but in avoiding the catastrophic penalties for delay. The area itself is a concrete slot, 60 meters long, bordered on both sides by chest-high barriers that separate performers from the street. At the far end, the barriers open onto Avenida Salvador de Sá, a 4-lane road that connects the Sambadrome to the wider city. On parade nights, the avenue is theoretically closed to traffic, but in practice, taxis, delivery trucks, and motorcycles weave through the gaps, searching for shortcuts. The police set up barricades, but the barricades are movable, and drivers in Rio are resourceful. Floats exit the Sambadrome and must immediately execute a 90-degree turn onto the avenue, then travel another 300 meters to the official dispersal point, a parking lot behind the Metropolitan Cathedral. But the turn is tight. The front wheels of a float can clear it, but the rear axle often drags against the curb, scraping paint and bending suspension. Drivers learn to take the turn wide, cutting into the opposite lane, which works only if no one is coming the other direction. On nights when 2 schools overlap in the dispersal zone, floats meet nose to nose in the street. And the only solution is for one to reverse, a maneuver that requires 3 people on the ground with flashlights, guiding the driver inch by inch while pedestrians press against walls. The people who manage this zone are not Samba School members. They are city workers, hired by the Municipal Traffic Authority. Wearing orange vests and carrying walkie-talkies, their job is to keep the flow moving, to prevent blockages, to make rapid decisions when something goes wrong. They do not dance, do not sing, do not appear in any broadcast footage. They stand at intersections with flashlights, directing floats like air traffic controllers, watching for overheating engines, dragging tires, or sparks from electrical shorts. One of them, a man in his 50s with a laminated ID badge clipped to his vest, works the corner where the floats make the turn onto Salvador de Sá. He has been doing this for 16 years. He knows which schools design their floats too wide, which drivers panic under pressure, which intersections flood when it rains. He keeps a toolbox in his truck. Spare bolts, duct tape, a hydraulic jack, and a fire extinguisher. Most years, he uses all of them. He has seen floats lose wheels, catch fire, and flip onto their sides. He has seen drivers abandon their vehicles mid-turn and walk away, overwhelmed. He has seen performers climb onto a stalled float and manually push it with their shoulders, still in full costume, heels digging into the asphalt, because the alternative is disqualification. He does not consider himself part of Carnival. He considers himself part of the infrastructure that prevents Carnival from destroying itself. The mechanical systems inside the floats are not standardized. Each school designs and builds their own, often using salvaged parts, repurposed truck engines, or custom welded frames. Some floats run on diesel generators. Others use tractor engines. A few have hydraulic lifts powered by air compressors that sound like industrial machinery, hissing and clanking under the decorative panels. The drivers sit in cramped compartments, sometimes barely large enough to fit their bodies, surrounded by exposed wiring and fuel lines, steering by instinct and radioed instructions from spotters on the ground. When a float stalls, the first response is to identify the failure point. Is it the engine, the transmission, the hydraulics, the electrical system? The driver radios the school's technical crew, who are already moving toward the dispersal zone, in a pickup truck loaded with tools. But accessing the engine requires removing decorative panels, which are bolted in place and surrounded by performers. The crew must ask people to move, to clear space, to step off the float, all while the clock runs and the judges watch and the next school waits. If the problem is the engine, the options are limited. The crew can attempt a restart, which works about half the time. They can bypass a blown fuse or reconnect a loose battery terminal. If the engine is overheated, they can pour water over it and wait for it to cool, which takes minutes they do not have. If the transmission is locked, they can attempt to shift it manually, a process that involves crawling under the float with a wrench while traffic moves around them. If none of this works, the float must be pushed or towed. Pushing a 40-ton float requires at least 20 people, coordinated and positioned around the structure, heaving in unison. Performers help, still in costume, their hands leaving smudges of makeup and glitter on the metal. Volunteers from the audience sometimes jump the barriers and join, anonymous faces in the crowd, pushing because they understand what is at stake. The float moves inches at a time, scraping along the asphalt until it clears the exit ramp and the next school can enter. Towing is faster but riskier. A truck pulls up, hooks a chain to the float's chassis, and drags it forward, but the connection points on floats are not designed for towing. The chain can snap, the chassis can buckle, the float can jackknife, blocking both lanes instead of one. Towing is a last resort, used only when pushing fails and time is gone. The penalties for delay are calculated in minutes. For every minute a school exceeds its allotted time in the Sambadrome, they lose a fraction of a point in the final score. A 2-minute delay might cost 0.2 points, in a competition where the difference between first and fifth place is often less than half a point. This is catastrophic. Schools have lost championships because of a 3-minute delay caused by a stalled float in the dispersion zone. The performance on the avenue can be perfect, the costumes flawless, the choreography synchronized, but if the float does not exit on time, the score collapses. This creates a tension between spectacle and reliability. Schools want to build the most ambitious floats possible, structures that rotate, elevate, and transform mid-parade. But every moving part is a potential failure point. Hydraulics leak, motors overheat, axles crack under load. The schools that win championships are often not the ones with the most elaborate floats, but the ones whose floats reach the dispersal zone intact. There is a woman who works as a logistics coordinator for one of the top schools. She does not design costumes or choreograph dances. Her job is to ensure that every float exits the Sambadrome within the time limit. She walks the dispersion route weeks before Carnival, measuring turn radii, checking pavement conditions, identifying bottlenecks. She creates contingency plans for every possible failure, mechanical, electrical, structural, and rehearses them with the technical crew. On parade night, she stands at the exit gate with a stopwatch and a radio, tracking every second. She has learned that the most dangerous moment is not the parade itself, but the transition from parade to dispersal. Performers are exhausted, adrenaline fading, attention scattered. Drivers are drained from an hour of intense focus, navigating a crowded avenue under floodlights. This is when mistakes happen. A driver misjudges the turn and clips a barrier. A performer steps off the float too soon and twists an ankle. A technician forgets to secure a panel and it falls off in the street. Her job is to keep everyone alert during this transition, to remind them that the show is not over until the float is parked and the performers are off the street. She radios constant updates to the driver, to the spotters, to the crew in the parking lot. She watches for signs of trouble, smoke, strange sounds, uneven movement, and calls for help before the problem becomes critical. She has prevented more disasters than most people in her school realize. The parking lot behind the cathedral is where the floats finally come to rest. It is an open expanse of cracked asphalt, large enough to hold a dozen floats at once, though they are packed so tightly that there is barely room to walk between them. The floats arrive in sequence, one after another, guided into position by workers with flashlights. Engines are shut off. Hydraulic systems depressurize with a long hiss. The structures settle, creaking and shifting slightly as the weight redistributes. Performers climb down, their costumes streaked with sweat and dust, makeup smudged, feathers bent. Some collapse onto the ground, too exhausted to stand. Others walk in slow circles, stretching cramped muscles, drinking water from plastic bottles. The energy of the parade is gone, replaced by a heavy, stunned silence. They have just completed the most intense 80 minutes of their year, and now they are in a parking lot at dawn, waiting for buses that may or may not arrive. The floats themselves look different in this space, stripped of movement and music. The decorations that sparkled under the Sambadrome lights now appear worn and fragile. The seams visible, the paint chipped. Some floats are already being disassembled. Workers with crowbars prying off panels, loading pieces into trucks. Others will sit here for days waiting for repairs, their structures too damaged to move. There is a moment, usually around 6 a.m, when the last float clears the Sambadrome and the dispersion area falls quiet. The workers in orange vests pack up their equipment. The traffic barricades are removed. The street sweepers arrive, pushing trash into piles, hosing down the asphalt. The city begins its return to normalcy, as if the night never happened. But the people who manage this zone remember. They remember the float that caught fire and had to be extinguished with handheld extinguishers, while performers evacuated in the dark. They remember the school that lost the championship because their driver took the turn too fast and sheared off a wheel. They remember the year it rained and the pavement turned slick and every float skidded through the exit, scraping against barriers, leaving trails of sparks. They remember because they will be back next year, standing at the same intersections, directing the same chaos, preventing the same disasters. The dispersion area is not glamorous. It is not filmed. It does not appear in highlight reels. But it is where Carnival succeeds or fails, where the precision of preparation meets the randomness of reality, where a mechanical failure can erase a year of work in minutes. The schools understand this. They budget for breakdowns. They train backup drivers. They install redundant systems. But no amount of preparation can eliminate risk entirely. Carnival is, by design, an event that operates at the edge of collapse, where everything must work perfectly, or the whole structure falls apart. The dispersion area is the test of whether that structure can hold. And every year, somehow it does. Floats stall, delays cascade, penalties accumulate, but the parade continues. The next school enters on time. The broadcast stays on schedule. The city absorbs the chaos and moves forward. Not because the system is perfect, but because the people inside it, drivers, workers, coordinators, performers, understand what is required of them and refuse to let it fail. If you'd like to see more of the systems that keep Rio's impossible events from collapsing under their own weight, you're welcome to stay with us for the next story.